Welcome to the Voyage Podcast, a show that traverses the oceans of myth and legend through the lens of Catholic theology and philosophy. Come aboard as we set sail in pursuit of the heroic life and Christian virtue, with your hosts, Mike Schramm and Jacob Platty.
Hey everybody, welcome to this very special episode of the Voyage Podcast. So it's special in the sense that I get to be as unprepared as Jacob is for all the other ones. We're going to be having a conversation, which, I mean, in one sense unprepared because I don't have my little outline like I usually do, but in another sense, Jacob and I have already had a very good discussion, which is kind of what prompted this, right?
Oh, wait. I thought you were about to say, Mike, in another sense, we've been preparing for this our entire lives.
Yeah, something like that.
Am I right?
So
yeah, that's what I would have said.
So this conversation, it was very much inspired by a recent example, but it's something that I think Christians have kind of had to have this conversation for really since Christianity. And it's the conversation between art and faith, or the scandalous content that can sometimes be found in very powerful and oftentimes very beautiful and very good pieces of art or media, right? Is that kind of, but specifically,
I think, no, yeah.
Specifically, we wanted to.
Well, let's just get into it.
Okay.
So here's how I would introduce this episode, Mr. Unprepared. Is basically The Last of Us is a TV show that we always intended to discuss. Surely it was going to be a big pop culture moment, and it's turning out to be true. But then episode 3 drops, and it's a very powerfully told story, and it's received universal praise from a lot of your typical media sources and things like that, or Hollywood commentators. I mean, it just knocked everyone out.
And this is episode 3, long time is what that one is. So if you're, familiar with it, or if you're able to, maybe not watch it, or maybe watch it, maybe you can decide afterwards. But anyway, like you said, it was very highly acclaimed, getting a lot of attention.
Fairly highly acclaimed, but I have a feeling that this episode is going to go down in history as that gay zombie episode, right? Because what they did is they told this really, really clean romance. And by clean, I mean to say just like a well-told narrative. Like, there's no fat on that episode. It's really, really good script writing. Like
it's technically proficient, right?
It's technically masterful, I'd even say.
Mm-hmm.
And also it doesn't fall into a lot of tropes that the queer community finds offensive. And so it's gotten a lot of...
Before anybody gets their hopes up, praise, you did refer to it as the gay zombie episode. The zombies are not gay in the episode. So if that's the... I don't want anybody to, after hearing all this and then watch it...
In case some people were into that, Mike? Is that what you're trying to say?
That would, in terms of, captivating television, I would want to know what happens next, so...
That would get some people interested in seeing it, that's for sure.
So, anyway.
But anyway, I felt, I was like, obviously as classical Christians, the Catholic tradition, it's problematic to have an episode that glorifies a homosexual relationship and euthanasia. And so I guess spoilers, I won't say any more than that, but the end of this episode does include euthanasia, and it is fundamentally about 2 homosexual men who spend their life together. It's a episode that jumps through time. It's kind of a standalone episode within the series. And it's just a very romantic episode. And it treats the romance
and in more ways
like
than one. That's the thing too that makes it powerful, is that it's not just romantic in the terms of sexual. It's romantic in the kind of classical sense of it creates this sort of high idealistic when it comes to relationships, but also when it comes to not so much life. If anything, it's more a high idealistic understanding of autonomy, which is why, like you said, it ends the way that it does.
Well, that's true. And so what I was thinking is there should be we should just address this type of thing head on because it raises important questions for Christians. How do you engage with art that demonstrates mastery, but also has some really nefarious stuff in it from a Christian perspective? And how does that compare with how we are engaging with the stories we've already engaged with? Every art form that we've talked about, every story that we've talked about so far, most of it has not been explicitly Christian. Mm-hmm. Most of it is probably including stuff in it that's not promoting Christian values.
But it's been more accidental to it, whereas this, it feels like it's more essential. Is that what you're...
This is very much a show that's really promoting something. It's a fairly ideological episode of that TV show, I would say. Though, admittedly, typically an ideologically driven storyline is going to end up on the cheaper side of things because it's hard to do that and still tell like a really, really good story. But they threaded the needle this time.
And this was where, in our original conversation,
it's a good,
we maybe disagreed a little bit. Maybe I was just kind of being the gadfly to try to provoke more conversation. But it's almost like you're saying it felt more like propaganda that was really, really good at hiding that it was propaganda. Or we're just, as a people, we're so bad at catching it. We're so dull to it that we won't catch it, but that it was still propaganda, right?
I think that you could call it propaganda. I think that I don't even know if I would necessarily use that word if I was having like a really honest conversation about it like we're having right now.
No.
If I was,
and honestly, I wouldn't either.
If I was just kind of like, if I was hanging out with people in shorthand, I might refer to as propaganda in the sense that a lot of what our culture is pushing through the media has a propagandistic element to it because it is capturing the spirit of the world right now and funneling that spirit through its storytelling. Though this one for sure, where it probably honestly could be defined as propaganda, is that the show creators are kind of out on the record as saying that we wanted to tell a gay romance story and we wanted to kind of blindside audiences with it. We wanted people who might not watch a movie or a TV show about gay romance to find themselves watching a TV show about gay romance and be moved by it so that we could move the needle a bit in the direction that we favor, which is the acceptance of homosexuality as a practice. And so that is propaganda. That is propaganda. It's just maybe all I would say is that propaganda tends to be more obvious and tends to be cheaper. And this was not that. This was subtle propaganda, and it was well done propaganda. And at that point, it's almost ill-defeating to call it propaganda because it has so much more meat to it than just the ideas that were trying to be conveyed. But whatever. I mean, it threads that line really well, and I think maybe people don't know how to talk about that very well.
And it's sometimes used as kind of like a disparaging term, like you only use propaganda when it's something negative. But the word itself does not necessarily have like an original like etymological negative connotation. We've just turned it into that because technically if you're going to say anything that has, a message behind it or wants to move you in some way is, well, that was the artist trying to like manipulate you. That's propaganda. Well, that's literally every piece of art that's ever been made.
Let's give it a counter example. How about The Passion of the Christ? 2003, 2004, Mel Gibson movie. Powerful film, powerful piece of art, really, really well executed. I think that people would refer to that as quote unquote propaganda or ideologically driven. And it's like, well, you can't deny that there's a motive to tell the story of Jesus and tell it in a compelling way so that people think about it and respond to it. I think that's what this Last of Us episode is the LGBT community making their Passion of the Christ. Almost literally. That's due to the nature of the actual story arc, which is fascinating to think about. like I said, we said, guys, this is kind of off the cuff conversation.
And
with a
it
little
does
bit of
kind of
setup,
remind
but-
me it kind of reminds me of some of the things that we sort of sent back and forth in terms of themes that we were recognizing, that if you were to just take that theme, you could have found that in any quote unquote Christian work of art, or any work of art that a Christian wouldn't have a problem with. And this kind of gets into the first part of what I want our conversation to kind of go towards is, for one, just not falling into that kind of oversimplistic view or response to the episode. I didn't want us to just fall into the same, like, oh, well, it's people doing bad things or it's glorifying bad things, so that's the only response that we can have to it, because then we're just white noise amongst all the other, quote unquote conservative or Orthodox Christians, little o Orthodox Christians that are responding to this or any other controversial piece of media.
Well, let me make that really personal. So I've been watching The Last of Us with my elder children. I have a 15 and a 14-year-old. Now, I mean, some people in the audience might feel like watching something that's basically rated R with kids that age is not how they would parent. And, I'm not saying that everyone should let their kids watch shows that we watch together, but just here's my confession. I am, in fact, watching that with my teenagers, for better or for worse. And I was one of those guys that got tricked into watching a gay romance, right? They certainly did not really lay that out. And not only was I that, but I was watching it with my 15 and 14-year-old, right? And I've had conversations about how Christianity teaches against homosexual practices. And my kids are aware of this. And I think that my kids have kind of internalized that okay. But here's the thing. When I watch a show like that tells a story of two people demonstrating legitimate love and affection for each other in such a human way, it's such a humanistically told story. My kids, I could tell when I was making some comments that my kids were understanding. They were not. It's hard for them to correlate the demonstration of love and sacrifice and humanity on the screen with my tirades against the homosexual act, right? In other words, the art is working. The propaganda is working. And for me to, when I speak out, if I'm going to speak out against this episode in front of my kids, with my kids, it has to be nuanced, because there's authenticity in that show. Like, in the story that's being told, there's authenticity. And if I pretend like it's not there,
it's just disingenuous.
Then it gives the lie. It's disingenuous. Yeah. And my kids know that. My kids would sense that. They'd be like, oh, Dad, you might not like, the homosexual act, but
what?
How can you deny the love?
They can't love each other.
Here,
they can't be
right?
good people. They can't be self-sacrificial people.
Yeah, they can't be good people and still sacrifice for each other. Blah blah blah. And so it's important for Christians and myself, someone who's raising kids amongst this pop culture, and allowing them to watch it, allowing them to participate in it, to just be honest about what is true in what Hollywood and content creators that are embracing the homosexual act, what's true about some of the things they're saying, and what's true about what can be presented in art and things like that. Because ultimately that's what we're doing in this entire podcast, is what's true about it, what's beautiful
and just
about
as a
it,
quick
what's worthy of conversation.
Well, and just as a quick sort of pause, or almost like a sidebar, one of the things that we also kind of talked about beforehand too was this was never meant to be a catechesis podcast. And so in terms of, we are maybe assuming some things when it comes to the Christian sexual ethic, or the historic Orthodox Christian sexual ethic, that we're not going to spend a lot of time elucidating here. There's plenty of podcasts, plenty of resources that go through, the Christian teaching on sexuality, beyond just that's weird, or that's gross, or that's icky, and that's why it's wrong. Hopefully that, we're not giving off that impression when it comes to the Christian response to this.
Well, and I do think, yeah, so what we said is that it shouldn't turn into a long conversation about why homosexual sex is wrong, why the homosexual act is wrong. But, I do think that we should give a very brief, basic understanding of what Christianity thinks about sex. And why, because honestly, if I don't know how many people can give a very well-reasoned, rooted in the tradition answer as to like what, why is it not love is love? Why can't we embrace homosexual union? Why do we have to reject it in the face of all of this authentic affection and romance? Why put a cork on that? And I mean, I would say in brief, what Christianity believes about sex is that it's really only appropriate in the context of a man and a woman, in the context of family building, in the context of coming together in order to create a community and live out the image of God, male and female, and create, when we're in the image of God, male and female, and we are producing creation through our union, and that procreation is what God, the love of God is embracing. It's why we exist to begin with.
Make a very quick distinction about that too. This isn't saying, like, the Christian teaching has never been that it's only right if it produces a baby, if there's it's that the act itself is ordered towards it. Now, God willing, that the life is brought from it, circumstances being what they are, but that's not what makes the action ordered or disordered. It's that it's still ordered towards the procreation and ultimately education, raising of children. And that's where the whole union of man and woman comes in, because it's first and foremost like Eros, the love of Eros is a love that's ordered towards union. And what is that union itself ordered towards? It's ordered towards, like you said, procreation. Even if the procreation doesn't happen, the act is still ordered towards it, right? So, just, like I said, just a quick distinction.
Well, and it's about how the world is organized. It's about how the cosmos is organized. It's about how we participate in organization and not chaos. And that organization, and I'm using the word organization because we're referring to hierarchy, holy order, and I'm just using a modern euphemism for something.
And even
like
that, it has the word organ.
Right?
That's like that kind of speaks to the physical bodily part of it too. But sorry to
Well, absolutely no. So anyway, and it's easier to see what's wrong when society doesn't pursue that ideal. And it's true that heterosexual union may not produce children, but the context is present and the intention is present, and the organization of the cosmos is being organized in that fashion. And then if you start doing things outside of that and embracing things outside of that as good, as promotable, as pursuable, you're actually bringing into things, it's a bigger sin than you anticipate. And part of the reason why we have a hard time, a lot of Christians have a hard time articulating what's wrong about the homosexual act, is because we view ourselves as fundamentally individualistic. That we're just atoms bouncing off each other. But what we do to ourselves or what we do with other consenting adults is just what those two atoms are doing. ATOM.
No sin is personal,
not AD.
right? No sin is just personal.
Yeah, and we have a very hard time viewing ourselves as first and foremost community. But that is, I think that's how the human condition was meant to focus, meant to exist at. That its fundamental units is community. And then there are the individuals that form those communities. And communities can come in different shapes and sizes, but it's not the individual. It's never the individual. Where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, there I am amongst them.
Well, and you can get even more theological with this and say it's a reflection of the Trinity, right? That it's the communion of persons, but it's the communion.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So there's a lot of deep thought baked into why we should not promote homosexual union. But then the other thing that I'll just briefly say is it's also fundamentally a question about the proper use of sex. And there's nothing wrong with 2 guys loving each other. There's nothing wrong with 2 guys demonstrating friendship towards each other. And when you add romance into that love, though, and by romance, what else can we really mean but ultimately the ordering ourselves towards physical union, and ultimately living happily ever after, raising kids and things like that. Romance means, just to put it crudely, romance means sex. It's always going to get reduced down to sex, and that's not untrue. And so what we don't have anymore is an understanding of love as something divorced from the act of sex. And now in culture, love only matters if it can be consummated with a sexual union. It's the only type of love that we promote, unless it's like whatever, child parent type stuff.
Well, and speaking from the point of empathy as well, like it makes sense that there's union would be desired, right? That there would be this desire for union, even if it is brought about through a disordered action, right? And so that's
Right.
where you can almost see like I get why there would be this strong desire, whether it's within this context of this show or the kind of larger, more general context, when it comes to just those people, right? Quote unquote, those people.
Those people,
I know.
Mike. I thought we were having a nuanced conversation.
Yeah, exactly.
Buddy.
No, that's my scare quotes. So, but this kind of let's bring it back to the speaking more specifically of this episode, like so
about the episode.
It's one of the things that when we're having this conversation is, we're talking about how is it propaganda, is it being hidden in all these other things, and I wanted to make the point of, who's the one doing the hiding, who's the one doing the propaganda, kind of just to be more provocative, right? Because one of the whole things,
a devil's advocate, if you will, Mike.
But flip it around. I want to be Providence's advocate, so to speak, because
okay.
One of the whole points of this show, of this podcast, and of Voyage Comics in general, it comes from that idea of seeds of the word, right? Where you're finding the points of the gospel that are maybe very much hidden in or buried under, right? The different things that we'll find, in whatever popular culture, even the more scandalous pieces of popular culture.
I think that that's true. And again, that's what makes this conversation interesting. Maybe one reason why it's easier to go look at something like the Odyssey or the Iliad and try to pull Christian lessons from it is that we're talking about things that are removed from our imminent culture. And we're talking about moral questions that are not the culture war that we're currently fighting and things like that. And so it's less scary, or it feels less sacrilegious, let's say, to look at older stories.
Yeah, I think there's something to that.
And raise questions about what's good in it and things like that. But if you talk about a story in the modern context,
we're less emotionally invested in the Odyssey than we are in, The Last of Us or something. Yeah.
Yeah, or the question of, the homosexual act and things like that. And, I use that language super specifically, the homosexual act, because I don't want to come across like I think that a homosexual person is any less dignified or any less worthy of human, respect and dignity as anybody else. But the act of homosexual union is what is the issue here. If that story had been a Sam and Frodo story, right? We got our Tolkien reference in.
Check that box.
Mandatory
check
Tolkien
that box.
reference.
Sure.
Where it's two best friends who love each other like brothers, and face, odds against something and come out the other side, and they could even die in the end, or one of them can die in the end, and any of them could die in the end, and you could hit all of the same elements that show wanted to talk about that were not related to the homosexual act and tell a super compelling story. Because part of the problem is this kind of goes back to what I was saying. There's a lot of commentary out there that kind of wants to manifest Sam and Frodo as, basically a homosexual couple.
Well,
right?
yeah. So even to your point is like, it's even when it's quote unquote virtuous or quote unquote, pure, there's still going to be that temptation or that proclivity to read into it.
We can only interpret stuff through, like we're so sexualized as a culture nowadays that we want to read that into everything. And we have a hard time viewing a relationship that doesn't have sex in it as beautiful or valuable
Or
as one that
realistic.
does.
Or realistic.
Or realistic
Which,
even.
well, and that actually
right?
kind of brings me to my kind of like rebuttal or response, or one of the things that I was thinking is, if that's sort of the reality, right? If we're in this situation where even the purest examples we're going to read into our disordered sexuality, so to speak, or our desires into it, whatever that happens to be, because it doesn't have to even be,
Yeah.
it doesn't have to be between two guys. That just happens to be, the scenario.
Achilles and Patroclus in the Iliad are famously gay with each other, right? I think there's ways to read the story in which they're not, but I think most people are okay accepting that that's actually a romantic relationship. There's romantic elements in that relationship. I mean, it's along these kind of ancient classical Greek Platonic categories, but to modern audiences, there's just a gay relationship. But we still talk about the Iliad as worthy of reading. We still talk about the Iliad and gain lessons from it and things like that. It was still taught by Christians throughout history, and there's a gay relationship in that.
Well, that actually kind of speaks to one of the things that I really wanted to talk about, because despite all of the what many Christians would say problematic elements, was there still something redemptive in the episode as a whole, or in the piece of artwork as a whole? And I was trying to point out that it's like, there is a redemptive arc, and it's an unexpected redemptive arc, but maybe it's the redemptive arc that needs to be told because of, whatever the situation we're being in. And that's where I jokingly said, like, I'm Providence's advocate, or it's Providence's propaganda, because even though, you could say, oh, these people are, doing the devil's work because they're telling people about bad stuff, or they're making bad stuff seem okay, is there something even deeper underneath that when it comes to, we'll just take the main character, Bill, right? Nick Offerman's character, right? And is there an even deeper redemptive arc, which, again, you can still choose not to like the episode or watch the episode or whatever, but it's still going to be watched? And is it still a message that can be a seed of the word? Does that make sense?
No, absolutely. Why don't you go ahead and lay out the argument here? I don't even fundamentally disagree with this. Go ahead. Yeah.
So yeah, one of the big things is, like, if you pay attention at the beginning of the story, but one of the other things too is that if in that letter, so at the end of the story, which I'll try to be as vague as possible since you didn't give any spoilers either, but the main character, Bill, main character of the episode, not of the whole series, you can very much tell that he is a person who is closed off to humanity, to the rest of the world, in a sense closed off to relationships completely, right? Absolutely. And it isn't until the entrance of this other character, of Frank, right, which, like you said, becomes the basis for this homosexual relationship or same-sex relationship, and that's what the rest of the episode follows. But it actually allows him to not only open up to Frank, but then also to these other people in the zombie apocalypse scenario, right? Because that's where Joel and Tess come in later on, as we see through the time jumps and stuff. And then it comes full circle when they find his letter, and it says, I basically did hate the world, or I was glad that, so many people were dying. And so you have this person who is completely myopic, who
you got a really, really angry relationship with
but is so closed off
and
to the very concept of relationship. Now, you imagine that if that person were to die in that state, who cannot even open up to any relationship, is there any hope for a relationship with God, regardless of what his background was before the apocalypse, his whatever upbringing he had or understanding of the gospel or anything like that?
Yeah. What's the greater sin? His homosexual acts that he participates in, or his inability to love?
Yeah. What's going to keep him more from relationship with God? And that's just it, is like, what if, and again, I'm speaking somewhat hypothetically or whatever, but it's like, what if Providence brought that person that was the only person that would have opened up to any semblance of relationship? And I say true relationship, not just because it was sexual. That's kind of what you got into earlier, but relationship because it was sacrificial, self-sacrificial in so many ways, as we saw throughout the whole episode.
Yeah, they change each other across time. They influence each other for the good.
Well, he defends him from those people who are trying to invade, right? So there's that whole kind of like defending from violence, but then there's also very much when Frank gets sick, he becomes a caretaker. And so it's sort of and I would almost argue it's a purgative or purifying experience when so much of what made them a couple is stripped away. They were still taking care of each other, right?
Right.
And so you have this Bill character who has now been at least opened up to one relationship. There's that tiny little crack in the armor. And is that going to be enough for grace to come in when he finally does die? Now, again, that's dismissing the manner in which they die and all that stuff, which that has its own considerations, and we can talk about that too.
Yep. I think they did a good job laying out the redemptive arc. It's kind of like it's the same old theme of someone coming into your life and changing you for the better, breaking down your walls. What we're going to see happen between Ellie and Joel, I'm sure.
Yeah.
Right. It's just a different couple of individuals in this case, different dynamic. If the father-daughter relationship is going to be what heals Joel, then this is the romantic relationship that's going to heal Bill. Right.
And yeah, we don't know of what wound was being healed necessarily, but that's not even the point, right? They're not even trying to tell that part of it.
Yeah. And so here's the thing. I don't think there's anything wrong with acknowledging everything that you just said. And I think that is what feels so authentic about that story that they told. I think that's what they told very well and very powerfully. And that's what people are resonating with, is the truth of how love can shape you and improve you and open you up to possibilities that weren't there before. And it's totally appropriate. It would be disingenuous to not acknowledge that is something that can happen between any human, individuals. Like any couple of humans can bring that out of each other.
And one of the things, though, of why I was trying to make this point, if you look at it on maybe overly simplistic, but I would say on the simplest level, is you ask yourself, in which scenario was Bill more likely to accept God's grace or relationship from God? Was it at the beginning of the story or was it at the end? And I can't see how you wouldn't say at the end, despite all of the other unsavory circumstances. Does that make sense?
Well, yeah, see, I could. Now, here's the thing. What we have here, I'm going to start pushing back on because I wanted to acknowledge what was true, right, and what was beautiful at first. But I also want to give voice to people who are still struggling with, well, how do I relate to this without it being just some kind of bigoted response, but still kind of give voice to what I know is wrong about this story that's being told. The redemption that this story is demonstrating as an analogy for the redemption that we're pursuing as we fight against our passions, as we fight against our sins, as we fight to become sacrificial lovers of each other as brothers and sisters in the church and things like that, as parents and people in relationship with each other. What we see this show can be an analogy for that. But at the end of the day, because of the nature of who we are as a society now, the love on display in that show ultimately proves to be deficient. And I think that is destructive even. It's very, again, we're trying not to be heavy with spoilers here, but there's a real Romeo and Juliet thing going on in this show. I mean, yeah. And I know that's just that's not a spoiler, right? But anyway, and Romeo and Juliet's not a moral. It's not a parable for how you should live, right? Mm-hmm. It's a tragedy. The ending of that is just sad. And the moral of Romeo and Juliet is that romantic love can drive you to self-destruction, right? And I think that at best, this is a story that falls into that mold, where romantic love can drive you to self-destruction. But what about all that good that they experience? What about all of the 20 years of life that they share that is all about them finding beauty in the world and building those relationships? And I think this is a good example of how you can have Christianity without Christ, so to speak, right?
Yeah.
Where if the sense of redemption that you are experiencing, the learning to love others outside of yourself that you're experiencing, is still ultimately for your own gratification instead of a self-sacrifice for other people, regardless of what you get out of it. That's not the theosis that Christianities are trying to achieve. That's not the union with God in perfect love that Christians are trying to. It's still a fundamentally about what I can get from other people. And sexual relationships, when they're outside of the familial unit, it's always about self-satisfaction. Whereas sexual relationships inside of a family unit, inside of the procreative context, even if it doesn't lead to procreation, like we said, is still a pleasurable experience that is for a different purpose than merely my own gratification.
And just another caveat to that too is the person engaging in the activity can have whatever motivations he or she has that's different from the act itself. So I might, I can use a objectively good thing for an evil purpose, right?
Oh, and look at how Christians do it all the time.
And straight people use it with
one
sex,
thing that we should
plenty. So it's
when you read the New Testament, at the end of the day, this isn't about homosexuality being wrong. It's about sex being so easily corrupted, whether it's heterosexual or homosexual. It is one of our biggest passions, maybe our biggest passion, right?
Yeah.
Maybe. Probably.
Tied to,
frankly.
well, yeah, when you, I mean, in terms of like, it doesn't have the same strict survival value that like eating and drinking does, even though the gospel or the New Testament says plenty about the importance or the moderation of that and that sort of thing. But it's something that, it's almost like it builds upon what's naturally there. Right? Maybe we need it as a species to survive, but an individual doesn't.
Well,
and yet
it's still a
driving
form of hunger.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's still a form of hunger. It doesn't, satisfying our stomach's hunger keeps us alive in the immediate moment. But the hunger for, sexuality and things like that, that's kind of a more of a long-term survival thing. It doesn't have the immediate benefits of like, eating food, but we're still driven to it. Which is why it's such a powerful passion, and which is why Christianity has such specific value for it.
And in the same way that, you were kind of describing in the ways that because it's such a strong passion, it's so powerful in its corruption. But in the same way, it can be the thing by which a person can be open to grace, right?
Oh, it can break down barriers.
And so obviously we can see that on the from both of our perspectives, that's why matrimony is a sacrament, right? It's because it can be the means by which a person receives grace, but by the means by like how unimaginable that God gives as a gift your spouse is the means by which you're going to go to heaven. I mean, what other how great of we couldn't have thought of a greater gift ourselves, and yet that's what the church has given us by making it a sacrament. But it's because, it's grace building on nature. Marriage was around before Christianity, and the sexual desire was around before we had even, evolved to the point where we had come up with, or God gave us the gift of marriage. Like even from the Adam and Eve perspective, even from the first group of people. And so that sexual desire was there. And so it's another example of grace continuing to build upon nature, even if it's an imperfect or a stunted,
example. Let me just throw in my little nuance here, or clarification. I don't think you're disagreeing with this, but only because it has the potential for tremendous sacrifice. In other words, sexual union and romantic love, it does not always lead to procreation. But if it is completely divorced from the procreative act, then it is only it is only self-gratification. It'd be like eating food that has no caloric value, but it tastes really good. And it's like, that's not good for your body, right? That's not good for the community in our case. But if so sex, the nutritive value of sex is correlated to its procreative value, because that's where the sacrifice is. That's where you give up of yourself to create another person, and then you take care of that person for the next 18 to 20 years of their lives. And there's a tremendous amount of transformation that occurs within the family structure. But trying to break down the family structure to just two individuals, especially if it's two individuals that are only there to kind of please each other. And even if there's all that other really, really good redemptive value in the friendship, right? That's what Christianity rejects, though, is that the sexual act could ever be divorced from a procreative familial context. And that's the only thing that Christianity rejects.
Yeah.
People outside of that, you can have people who are even romantically attracted to each other, but as long as they don't abuse the act of sex, just like a heterosexual person should not abuse the act of sex outside of marriage and things like that, then there's no sin. The sin is in the disorder of sex. So when it comes to this TV show that we just watched, it's not their love for each other or the impact they have on each other or the beauty that they create together. They're bringing like harmony and order, a little walled garden, a little Garden of Eden in this apocalyptic wasteland. Right?
And you actually get a sense of that.
They're
in
an
that
Adam and
scene,
Steve,
right? Where
no, they're literally Adam and Steve. It's literally a story about that, right? And at the end of the day, there's a lot of truth in the depiction of two people coming together and through their friendship making the world beautiful around them.
And I think
physically,
this again
right?
isn't so much I don't think this is something you disagree with, or it's more like a yes and, but like when it comes to, as much as I want to like advocate for some possible redemptive quality to this, you could almost say that maybe it's more accidental than it is essential to it, right? Any sort of redemptive quality or redemptive arc is accidental, which in one sense I'm not going to it's not a hill that I'm going to die on necessarily or whatever. But
let me contrast it again. So like with the Iliad, right, where there's a really prominent gay relationship in the Iliad. What I would say is that The Last of Us episode 3 is a gay romance that has redemptive qualities in it. But I would not say that the Iliad is a gay romance that has war virtues in it. The Iliad is a story about war and the virtues that are the virtues and the passions that are in it, that happens to have a gay relationship in it, right? That's even an important element of the story, but still it's accidental to the larger themes at play. Whereas I think that even the creators of the TV show would admit that they wanted to tell a gay romance, and so they decided to use The Last of Us as the aesthetic to achieve that.
And I think
story.
When it comes to because again the what kind of kicked this whole thing off was like, what's the more nuanced, subtle, quote unquote Christian response to this, as opposed to just immediately celebrating it, right? Compromising Christianity for the culture, or immediately dismissing or almost like building walls against it and then not engaging. What is that engagement?
Because that's dishonest. Because here's the thing, it would be dishonest to pretend like there's nothing good on display there. I really wanted to emphasize that, because if we do that, if we just pretend like there's just nothing beautiful in that episode,
We won't
people won't believe
we won't
you
be taken seriously when we try
because
to
you're
show
wrong.
what is beautiful.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. It can't be just ideologically dismissed. We have to engage it and acknowledge it.
So this is where, like, if Christians need to, play the long game when it comes to not just the redemption of that person right across from us, but like we're tasked with the redemption of, not just the American culture, but the whole world, right? We are participating in the redemption of the whole world. Then how do we play the long game, right? And this episode was called Long, Long Time. How do we take a long, long time when it comes to, interacting with, engaging with these examples that are, like you said, even in some ways essentially scandalous or essentially problematic, not just accidentally. And that's where, yeah.
Here's where what I'll add into that, because I think I know where you're going with this, Mike. If this is what's going to, if this is a story that people can see a message of sacrifice and a message of personal redemption, can that not be a gateway towards a larger experience of Christ?
Larger conversation on grace, larger
gospel,
conversation on, the gospel.
Things like that. And, I think that's the best we can do with this episode. I think that's what we should do with this episode. But I'll also push back and say you could go watch Lord of the Rings and see a show about redemption and how two people can sanctify each other and just not bring a sexual romantic element into it.
Well,
and so
to push that
we
back,
don't need
people could just
TV
read
shows.
the Odyssey, or people could just read the Bible too, So it's like,
well, I know, but I'm saying we could so The Last of Us episode 3 could have not been about a gay romance. You could have told most of that story as far as hitting the actual action beats of what's happening, and it would be more like something like the TV show Supernatural, where it's two brothers that love each other and are, the most important thing in each other's lives. And still, we'll get into Supernatural sometime, I'm sure. But anyway, you could still tell every single action beat in that TV show, Last of Us episode 3, and not be promoting the disordered sexuality. And so we don't need TV shows like that to talk about these themes. And I'm not convinced that it's good to make TV shows like that, because that's the only way we could tell gay people about, the beauty of self-sacrifice or something like that.
And I guess it's not so much like an encouragement for Christians to do it. It's more like responding to the reality that's already there. In the same way that, like, would God have chosen to raise up the Roman Empire? No, but it was in the context of the Roman Empire that he chose to send his son and build the church. Right. And so,
and I 100% agree with that.
So that's maybe
because that's what we have to do. We have to take what's there. Everything that I'm saying is like, wouldn't it be nice if, but to your points, they did create a piece of art. They did create a powerful story. It does have these elements in it. The world is celebrating it. How do we talk about this story, acknowledge what the world loves about it, but then also still be true to what we've received from God and from our faith, and that's what this podcast is all about. And I'm not sure that I did such a good job having condensed kind of thoughts this time around. We're really reacting to this, and I wanted to react to it on this platform because there was a lot of reactions in general out there, and this is just too important an opportunity to see in real time an example of really, really powerful culture building happening. But some of the elements of that culture building are in opposition to what a traditional Christian is going to be able to promote or able to just give their kind of unvarnished appreciation for. And we should have that conversation in public.
And I think this kind of goes back to it's reacting without being reactionary. And actually, I think one of the things that we wanted to kind of looking ahead, because we did sort of have a plan already set in place for an episode before the Last of Us episode dropped, you and I wanted to have a conversation that was more proactive when it came to what are some principles that can be put in place for a Christian who's going to react to or going to experience different things in media. And so I think this, hopefully we have applied some of those principles here, but we haven't necessarily laid them out as cleanly as, like you said, like you would have liked to have done, or just because, it's very much an authentic, like, what was I thinking? What was I feeling right as I watched this? But not only after you watched the episode itself, even though you knew as you were watching it, like, this is going to be a phenomenon, like this is going to be really popular. This is going to be, this is going to make some waves.
You could see the headlines. You could see the reviews writing themselves.
But then even in seeing the responses, seeing the acclaim, just the accolades that it was receiving, the next day or the next couple of days, all the different talk that was going about it. And so, there was that element of reacting to it, but then it's from those kind of principles of like, okay, it's trying to look for those seeds of the word, or trying to find maybe the deeper redemption arc to it, or not even just like putting up with the bad, but even seeing how the good is hidden in the bad, just like people are always willing to find the bad that's hidden in the good, right? When it comes to propaganda and artwork and stuff. Well, what if you flipped it around? And that's kind of what, we both were kind of interacting about and talking through, disagreeing about even, when it came to this specific example.
Well, and I think I kind of played nice for the sake of the podcast. I think that there was less disagreements. Yeah, I know. Well, that's just the way it goes. I mean, it is a sensitive topic, and I'm not trying to give a bad name for myself or whatever, but also there's a lot of assumptions baked into it. Like, one of the things that we never got around to talking about was, well, what would have happened? This is a story about how a person is brought into a person's life, and he is redeemed from his inhumanity by the presence of this person in their life. But one thing that you could do is ask the question, well, what would that guy's life have looked like if someone had not shown up, and if he had continued to persist as a hermit, if you will? And could this be a conversation about, this tradition of going out into the wilderness and contemplating life for 20 years, right? That's so prominent in Christianity. Would there have been redemptive value for Bill in that context?
Which, again, referring to it as a life as a hermit implies that there was a certain motivation to it, right? Which the point I was trying to make is that it wasn't necessarily there. Now, could it have become that? Well, of course, anything could have happened, right? But in terms of what needed to happen,
and it is a hypothetical thing.
But in the same way, like, what would have been the one thing, going back to Providence, like, what was the one thing that Providence knew had to happen to break down that wall or open that up? And would it have just been, staying in seclusion? I mean, we get this indication that as the audience, that would have just continued him on that myopic path, right? But there again, I mean,
well, I'll push back on this a little
now
bit more.
Now we can actually start
now
we can start disagreeing, I guess, right in the tail end of the show.
Yeah, right. Yeah, at the end, now that we're at the end, I'm going to start, fighting back more. There is one of the things that we shouldn't do that maybe I do in other examples, right? But that seems obvious in this moment anyway, is read too far into some of these stories that we're using as, opportunities to find, Christian themes and things like that. At the end of the day, this episode, for all the talk of redemption that we've said and applied to it and things like that, does not in fact end in a very Christian way.
It doesn't walk through the pearly gates, at least from what we see.
Yeah, right. Like, this is not the redemption that we're talking about. It's only a loose analogy for the type of redemption that we're ultimately seeking as Christians. Really, we're just saying that Bill found his humanity through the help of Frank showing up. But it's a broken, sinful humanity that he finds. There's no sense of him finding Jesus in this episode, right? And, kind of to my points, you can imagine a story in which a person does spend their life isolated and alone, and maybe in that moment when they have nothing but opportunity to reflect, nothing but opportunity to, be distanced from humanity, then they can actually learn to love humanity again, right?
There presumably would have been a library in that small town that had, Plato's Dialogues or something. So it's like...
Right, yeah, something like that. So, I mean, like, obviously that's just us just making stuff up, right? I'm just saying that we're still assuming that it's an unfettered good to bring romance in as a means to tell a good story, right? Or at least that's just a story they wanted to tell in this place. But you can do that story without promoting something that Christianity is going to find ultimately destructive for communities, right? But they wanted to tell a story that was going to promote the kind of love is love mentality that drives a lot of our pop culture today. And I guess if nothing else, you can hear me engaging with that, wrestling with that, thinking out loud about it.
You're the old man yelling at the cloud.
Finding that balance. Old man yelling at the cloud.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's me. I feel like that's what I'm doing right now. But, I want there to be a conversation about this. And not just, like you said, Mike, falling into this idea that either you love this episode or you hate this episode because you're a bigot or something like that. I think it's a more interesting episode.
That's just it. Is like, it's, and we've already gone through this, so we don't need to rehash this whole thing, but it's really, from a Christian perspective, it's about honesty. It's honest engagement. And honest engagement is not hiding away or building up the walls of the citadel, but it's also not, compromising to it. It's not becoming one with it, with whatever, hot topic it happens to be. And so that's where I think, like, hopefully this provides some sort of like tools or principles, and we want to, not necessarily as a direct follow-up to this, because this probably won't come until later, but where we do kind of put down, okay, we're not talking about one specific example, but in general, using some other examples from our just experience in pop culture, what principles can we put down in terms of engaging with these problematic elements? And it doesn't have to be so hung up on, is it this issue or that issue, but how can we see this more generally? You know what I mean? And that's kind of what, just going forward, whenever the next Last of Us episode 3 comes out, because it's going to happen again in a month or in 6 months or something like that. What's going to be the next reaction to it? Have we come away? Have we, learned from it or grown from it or something like that?
Sure.
Yeah. Well, no, I always enjoy all of our conversations, especially when they can be, friendly and disagreeable and things like that. But thanks for coming on.
More of a serious episode, folks. One that was really off the cuff. Hopefully, it was still enjoyable, but kind of different for us.
Well,
I'll admit that.
Just as thoughtful and provocative as the others, but maybe heavier. I don't know. But anyway, we thank you guys for joining us for this whole thing too. And we just want to ask again, like, subscribe, rate 5 stars, leave a positive review for the Voyage podcast, because if we want to grow this, we want to expand this, we want to have this reach as many people as possible. So anything that we can do to just keep the conversations going, keep the conversations about the necessary presence of pop culture, but then how does the Christian thoughtfully and powerfully engage?
Well said, Mike. Well said.
Wasn't it? See, just like the script said, Jacob. Exactly. Did it sound natural?
Yeah, it sounded as natural as you can sound.
Thanks for listening to Voyage Podcast. The Voyage Podcast is a production of Voyage Comics and Publishing, which seeks to create exceptional entertainment informed by Catholic values that inspire people to live a heroic life. Voyage Comics seeks to advance truth and beauty found in powerful stories. To learn more, visit voyagecomics.com. You can also follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.